So today we're discussing Everybody Writes by Handley, right?
Handley, yes.
Right. So should we start by sharing, how we would describe this to somebody we don't know or who hasn't read the book?
Good idea. Yes. I would describe this book as a foundational guide for anybody who wants to write or who uses writing as part of their work, which was one of the main reasons why we chose it, because copywriting stems from good writing. So if you don't have the techniques of good writing there, you're not going to be a successful copywriter. So I would say that it's a guide to writing, a practical how-to guide with great examples, and that it's also a fun read.
Completely agree. I would say something similar. I think it's kind of a call to writing, like it's an invitation for anyone and everybody. And what fascinated me about it as somebody who is a copywriter is that it actually inspired me. It took me back to when I first fell in love with writing and made me want to write more and explore my writing and get better at writing. And I think what I would say to anybody is that this isn't just for people who feel they can't write or people who aren't writers or describe themselves as not being writers. I think it's for anybody. I think it's for an experienced copywriter as it is for someone new to writing.
I love that you said about it being a call to writing, because as you read it, you can, and the author is very good at communicating her passion for writing. And it does give an inspirational quality of, oh, this is something that I'm actually privileged to be able to do. And it really helps you to move through any mental blockages you might have about writing so that you can actually just get down to it and do it.
So you bring up something interesting, and it's something that I wrestled with. It's something that I also made a note about. And it's the idea that it's the name of the book, Anybody Can Write. And I really, I struggled with that quite a bit because I pride myself on being a writer. Like that's how I make my money. And so when you say to me, everyone can write, it almost cheapens the skill on the one hand. On the other hand, again, it somehow takes the stress out of it and shows you that like this is something that with work anybody can become better at, which I think is a great point. And a few things that she says, for example, she says writing well is part habit, part knowledge of the rules, and part giving a damn, which I loved. Like how there's something humorous and fun and how we can all become better at it with just a bit of work.
Yes. Did you think with those 3 points there that you were lacking in any of them, or did you think, oh, I already have these three qualities and I just need to go for it?
Which was a bit of a slap on the wrist a little bit. And one of the points she makes is it isn't about writing a lot, it's about writing often. And I do write often, but I write often in a very strategic way because it's for money. And I do give a damn about writing. So that part for me is taken care of. What about you? Like, how do you respond to that point?
I totally agree with you in that I do write a lot because, like you, I write for money. But my writing, I think I've been coasting a little bit because I write for my clients and I was calling that my writing. And in a sense, it is writing, but since I'm being paid for it, perhaps it's not fair on my behalf to warm up my writing brain by going straight into client work. And what would actually be fairer is doing that warm up on my own dime and writing for yourself in a way where it's personal to you and you're not getting paid for it, is a great way of developing your own voice and sharing your own thoughts. And I found if I don't do that enough, that can leak out in my client work as well, because I'll shove in a little idea there that I've had, which actually doesn't necessarily belong there. And it's not that it's not a good idea. It's just that that's not the space for it to live, and it should live somewhere else. So yes, the writing habit was really important to me. The giving a damn, I think I gave a bit of a damn before, but reading the book was a reminder that actually you need to give quite a lot of a damn.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I love what you said about not warming up on your client's dime. I never thought about it like that. I think that's very clever. And I think a lot of the stuff she talks about in the book, it's like an opportunity to not do that. It's an opportunity to like warm up. I like this.
Yeah, I mean, she quite often uses the analogy of, sports or marathon running or something. And when you think about it, if you're running for your country for the Olympics, you wouldn't get to the start line, hear the gun, and then be like, don't worry, guys, I'm just going to stretch out my quads and then I'm going to go straight away after that. No, you've got to do the warm up first.
Yeah, that's really true.
Yes.
And she also says that writing isn't an art, which again, I think links back to what we've been discussing about how it's something you need to practice, how it's a habit. It also didn't sit so well with me again, which maybe sounds arrogant. Not to say that I've like mastered the art of writing and I'm like this amazing writer, but I always looked at writing as like almost like a gift. So like it's something that I wrestled with throughout the book. Yeah. It's something that I've been thinking about. Once you accept the premise that everybody can write, it somehow changes what we do and what we bring to the table. I don't know if you struggled with that or that's something that stood out for you in the book.
I think she does talk in the book later on about the hot dog writing, where it's a kind of writing done by committee, because unfortunately you need 7 people to sign off on the writing. And that means each of them is going to have their own little idea of what the piece should be like, or what it should include, or how it should sound. And she does give some great advice about how to cut down on that. But I think that comes from this. It's hard to say, because I don't want to say not everybody can write, because that's not correct. But I think it's she's good at giving you the knowledge and the tools, so that even though everybody can write, that you as the writer are the one who's perhaps better prepared for this particular piece of writing. So that's, I think, where I would see that line as falling between, yes, everybody can write, and it's not this sort of talent that you drink, straight from the nectar of the gods, and that you then regurgitate. I like her philosophy of it's something that you can get better at, and something that you can keep trying and improving at, rather than this kind of binary, yes, you can write and you're a great writer, or no, you can't write and you shouldn't even try.
I agree. And I think that a lot of the book is structured in a way that makes it like a handbook or like a guide to writing, which I think is helpful for the reader. And I think that one of the things that really stood out for me was her emphasis on empathy and focusing on the reader.
Yes, I noted that as a point to bring up as well.
Yeah, and I think that like it's not a rule in writing, but it's something very valuable to think about. And I think it's something that when I'm approached, let's say someone brings me their copy to improve, or I'm discussing copy, it's something I see a lot of people forget about writing. And again, it's not a rule, but it's just something about thinking, because once you embrace empathy, it's about thinking about the reader and who's going to read this, and switching the focus from like what I do or from your technology or your service to the person who you're actually speaking to, which I think is very valuable.
Yes, yeah, that the point of the empathy in the one reader is, I mean, that's not revolutionary. Certainly for copywriting, you're always told to think about the reader and to center the reader or the customer rather than yourself as the brand or product. But it's always a good reminder, and particularly that empathy of catching the reader where they are right now and thinking about them as a person rather than a profile, which you can do a little bit, which people can do a bit too much of in copywriting. I think it was a good example of empathy as a practice that you can apply throughout writing. And it's a point that she comes back to often in the book, which shows, just how central it is as a principle.
Shall we discuss other takeaways?
I think it perhaps. Oh, I was just going to say, if we could talk a little bit about how the book is structured for somebody who's not read it before, because it's written as a guide that you can read and consult to get better at writing, but she's structured it in a way that makes it very useful. So the part 1 is about writing processes, which we've touched on a little bit, but I think we come back to because there's so much discussion material in there. The second part is about grammar and usage. And as she says, you might have thought that the whole book would just be about grammar and usage, whether you use then or than, that kind of thing. But actually it's not. That's the middle section of it. And I don't think that we'll discuss that as much because it's essentially a list of grammar rules. And I would say to a listener, it's very worth reading. The fact that we're not going to talk about it doesn't mean it's not important. It's just grammar rules. And actually that's a section of the book that I can really see myself coming back to consult. Right. And then the final section of the book is applying the things that you've learned to what you might actually write, which is particularly written with marketers in mind, because she covers things like social media copy, writing emails, creating a brand voice, writing captions for photos, speeches. So I think there's discussion material in that too, but I think if we could go back to the beginning where we're talking about the writing process, and perhaps we can talk about what did you think, Nicole, when you were reading that part, and what bits in that part stood out to you?
I think it's a great point. In terms of process, I loved her idea of the writing GPS, which is this almost like a GPS, like a guide to how to think about writing. Yes, I love the fact that
I noted what GPS stood for actually in my notes because I knew I wouldn't be able to remember it.
I forgot completely. So that would be great if you could share that.
So it's Handley's writing techniques that she uses to go from 0 to 100 in writing. And there are 17 stages. I haven't written down all 17. You go if you can remember them, Nicole. But she divides these stages into 3 sections called the GPS, which is go, push, shine. So if you want to explain what you thought when you were reading it and what these stages are, how you talk about it to somebody who's not read the book.
I'm going to focus on something that really stood out to me out of all the phases, because I don't want to misquote. But the shine part, the last part, which is focusing on editing, really stood out to me as a copywriter. Because as much as I edit and review, it's not something that I actually spend that much time on. It's not something I enjoy. And she has a whole part devoted to the editing process and the polishing process. And I think that's very insightful. And it's very, very valuable, I think, for all writers to take that into account.
Yes. Yeah.
Other aspects of her GPS, I know, focus on research. And she's a big advocate of thinking before inking, which is kind of, which I really like. But I wanted to say, like, something that I encounter a lot as a writer is this fear of like the blank page. Like I sit down and I have to write. And I don't know, it's for a client. I know I have to write something. I have the topic. But, getting started for me is always very, very hard. And she has this whole section where she talks about how you can basically scrap the first paragraph. And I think to me, this comes down to the thinking before inking part, because I find that if I've come to writing, having thought the piece through, and like really spend time on that, which is something Anne also addresses in the book. It's not easier, but I find it's less painful for me personally as a writer. And over the last year or so, I've developed a technique. So what I do is I use Otter, which is like it's an AI tool which converts your like speech into like notes. It like writes it out for you. And it's like I just speak out what I want to write, like what I'm thinking about. Like after I've done all the research and everything about the topic, I kind of go for a walk and I just talk into my cell phone. And then what it does is it turns it into notes. And then I pop that into my document and then I start writing like this. And she also talks about like the dirty first draft. So it links then and it gives me something
the ugly first draft.
Yeah, ugly first draft. Yeah. So that was what I from that section.
Oh, that's interesting. I use Otter for my client work for my podcasts, and I'd never thought to use it in that way. So that's a really good tip for other copywriters.
And in terms of the GPS, like, what did you take out of it, or how do you apply it to your work?
What really stood out to me was, well, two things. The first is in the shine part that Anne Handley actually gives a process for editing. And I'm going to put my hand on my heart here and say I earn a living as a writer, and up to now I have never had a process for editing my own work. And it's embarrassing to admit it. Kind of hope that none of my clients ever hear it, but I doesn't have an editing process. I mean, I have an editing process for, I have a spell check, but I think that my brain gets a bit overwhelmed in the editing process, and Anne is very clear about different kinds of editing and the purpose that they serve. And broadly, she splits that into two categories of an overall sweep where you're looking at things like clarity. Are your ideas clear, and do they link from one to another to pull the reader from the title all the way to the end, which is kind of the macro view. And then she talks about the micro view of line by line editing for things like grammar, comma usage, that sort of thing. And also she pointed out that you add in personality later on in the editing process. So you get your ugly first draft done, which she calls the TFD, the ugly first draft. And it's okay if the ugly first draft is ugly. All it has to be is writing about this idea that you researched. So I love that idea of the different kinds of editing in a more structured way, but also taking the pressure off your own writing to have this kind of brilliant sparkling personality as it drips out of your fingers through the keyboard onto the page. It doesn't need to be that. What it needs to be is just writing. So that was one thing that stood out to me broadly. And the second was when she talks about publishing, and she talks a bit about almost the grief of publishing. At a certain point, even you've done your different kinds of editing, you've added in the personality, you've checked your facts and so on, but you know that the piece of writing could always be a little bit better, and yet you publish it anyway because at some point you just have to let go of it.
Right.
And I don't think that I experienced that grief intensely, but I feel it on some level. And actually, not to psychoanalyze myself too much, but I think part of that grief for me came from, I don't know if I'm editing this right. I don't know if I'm doing this right. I think I'm just going to have to publish it because I've got to have something to show for all this work that I've put into this piece. So I'll just hit publish and kind of walk away from it. And sometimes I felt kind of embarrassed or ashamed about that, but she has the tools that help you to get over that, and also to recognize that maybe you will still have a feeling of this could be better, but you have to let the writing be what it is and share it with the world and get better on the next piece.
Right. So following up on what you just said, for me, there are two parts of it. the first, is exactly what you said about this ugly first draft and how it's very liberating for writers, I think. And I think that that's something, like, for me personally, that I struggle with. I approach and I start writing, and then I delete because it's not good enough and doesn't sound the way I want it to sound. And once you let go of that and you just allow yourself to create this horrible first draft, this ugly, first draft, it's very freeing. And as you said, then later on you allow yourself to sprinkle in the personality. That's great. And again, your last point about the publishing part, that's also very freeing, because then you kind of you let it go.
Yes.
And you accept that at some point you just have to let it go, which I don't think I struggle with that as much now as a writer. I struggled with that in the beginning when I was starting out. I'm ashamed to say that I've been writing for over a decade, and I still struggle with some of these things. And as you said at the beginning, I also don't have a process for editing. So I have a process for writing.
I'm glad to hear that it's not just me.
I think it's a fascinating topic. Sorry, I'd be curious to know other copywriters, like if they have. I think a lot of copywriters have processes, and as you become more advanced, people develop other processes. But I think that's a neglected. Maybe I'm wrong. I think that's a neglected process. I think people either DIY it or they outsource it.
Yes. I know that Joanna Weeb has a sort of 7 sweeps of editing process, but I cannot remember what they are. I imagine it would be touching on different things like a sweep for grammar, a sweep for factual accuracy, a sweep for logic building on itself in a coherent way. But yeah, if there are other copywriters out there who have an editing process, I'd like to hear about it. And if there are copywriters out there who don't have an editing process, you can get in touch too.
Please do.
Yeah, join the shame group. We've got cones for everybody.
I'm gonna, since we're being, vulnerable and sharing our shame and like walking into our shame closets, I'll be honest, like, I actually don't enjoy editing. Sometimes for me, I'll just give a bit of background to this. So I write for clean tech companies. So often what I'm dealing with is very, very complicated. And so I'm swimming in all this complicated stuff. And my challenge, which is how I market myself, is taking this super complicated stuff and making it accessible. So by the time I get to the point where I have to edit, I am drained, and it's not that I don't enjoy it, but it sometimes feels a little bit like giving birth, I'll be honest. I think writing also brings up issues of imposter syndrome and all sorts of things, which I think, and stuff helps. And I think that because of that, I've had to kind of come up with my own process as a way of staying sane. And but for me, it stopped just before the editing. Like, somehow I never took that into account. I'm just like, ship it off to the client and that's it.
So what, in your previous iterations of writing, what changed from your first draft to your final draft? I think it'd be interesting to have that, if you say that now as a comparison, and how you would perhaps change that in the future. That could be interesting for other copywriters to hear.
Like my process. So before I submit, I do like a basic edit. So like I do like grammar and stuff like that. And then I do just a general once over read, kind of just to make sure that it makes sense. As I said, I don't think it's very thoughtful, my process. And I don't think it's process driven, which it should be, like Anne's. I think Anne's is a very good step. And then what I do is I submit that to the client, and they give me feedback, and then I change based on that. But you know what I mean? Okay. What I do, I never just submit copy. Like, I always give them this first page, which is a bit designed. And I have at the top of this kind of cover page, things I want them to consider at every step. So for example, like in the first draft, I explain, I do a skeleton, first draft, second draft, final version. So in the skeleton, I explain what's happening here, what this is, what the point of this is. And I also give, I set up the document and I explain to the reader, like, what I want from you, like what kind of feedback would be helpful for me.
Yes.
And the same for the first draft. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's interesting. I'm thinking this in my head, and it sounds a bit harsh, but I'm going to say it anyway. You're sort of outsourcing your editing to the client. I
mean, yes, it's an interesting point. Yes and no. Like, it's not like I do what I consider editing. You know what I mean? Like, I edit the piece, but then I give it to them for feedback.
Yes, true. Yeah, no, I've probably conflated the two of editing and asking for feedback. It's not the same thing.
No, like I think that like I don't send a piece that's like full of errors or grammar mistakes or you know what I mean, like that obviously not. And I do check the piece, but like I don't believe. No, I know my process isn't anywhere near as thoughtful as Anne's. Like it just isn't. It you know, so that's something I would like to change. Like I want to look at my process and like implement a proper editing process. The problem with me as well is I think I have like some ADHD tendencies. And so like I struggle with deadlines and I tend to leave things for the last minute. And so often to do what Anne does, you have to have this buffer. You have to have the space because the editing kind of has to mull and it's thoughtful and it's slow.
I think that that's one of the stages in the 17-step process, isn't it? That you that she recommends that you walk away from the piece and come back to it, which it means by default you have to have buffer time.
Yeah. And I think again, like it comes back to writing being something thoughtful because you're baking the time in, you know, into your process. And you know what, I will say this, like again, as somebody who's been writing for a long time, I can look at my process from like when I started to now. And I can tell you that it definitely there's work. And I think everybody is always improving. But I can tell you that when I started off, I didn't even have like a skeleton. I would like send what I felt was like a final version to the client, just the copy. No context, nothing. So I feel like I've come a long way from that very humble point. But this book really, really did show me like the horizon, and it inspires me to want to do more with my writing, with my craft.
That's nice. It offers a way to finesse your writing skills, perhaps, as well as being an introduction for people who've not really written before.
Totally.
I wanted to just mention we have spent a bit of time discussing the 17 stages. However, at the very beginning of the book, she writes for the reader that you don't have to follow her rules exactly. She's not prescriptive. So I personally find her suggestions really useful, and I think I'll be applying quite a lot of them. But she's not saying this is the one way, the golden path to successful writing. It actually includes quite a nice analogy right at the beginning of the book where she talks about it being like a bowling alley, and you can use the lane bumpers like for kids and for people who are bad at bowling like me. And so rather than it being rules or stages that you must check off, you can use these processes to guide your writing, so your writing can kind of bounce off them like the bowling ball until you get to the end and you get a strike. So in that way, I think that she's following her own rules about empathy there, because I think for some people it would be really intimidating to think, oh, I must follow these 17 stages of writing, even though I just need to write 3 lines of copy for an email about a flash sale. You probably don't need to be that intense every single time, but I think if you start practicing the rules on your writing, you'll get a better sense of them as you go on.
I think it's an excellent point, and I think that it's helpful, as you said, for beginner writers and also for more experienced writers, because it gives you the guardrails.
Guardrails, that's the word.
And also something that I wrote down is that, and I think that this is it the fact that she emphasizes what you said, that she's not prescriptive. It undoes a lot of the damage that school does. If you go back to school and writing in school, I think that that's where a lot of people shut down when it comes to writing. I think a lot of people have blocks when it comes to writing because of school. And in this book, how Anne talks about how there are no rules, and she talks about empathy, and she talks about, you know, considering your audience and also your real voice. She has this beautiful example. I don't know if you remember, for this, I think it's a real estate guy, and on the homepage, the one button is see properties or something, and the other one is call, I don't know.
Larry.
Call Larry.
Yes.
And that's the button on the homepage in the hero copy section. It's incredible. No? It's different, it's creative, it's real. And she made the point that I think she spoke to him or she spoke to someone about the copy. And it has this kind of old-timey feel, like pick up the phone and call the guy. And that's him. That captures his essence, which is something so liberating. And she says there's no one way to write a homepage, to write a LinkedIn post. There are many bad ways to do it, but it's not that this is the way to do it. She says if somebody tells you this is the only way to write, they're trying to sell you something.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. That reminded me of a point that I want to bring up that she does throughout the book, which for me was very enlightening, that the examples that she uses of good writing they're real examples. It's not things that she's created, but they're also very diverse. And in my mind, maybe I'm being too fancy, but if somebody asks you, oh, what's an example of great writing? I'd be like, oh, well, Charles Dickens is just such an amazing author. And I think I was shooting too highbrow in my examples of great writing. And that's obviously, I'm not saying that writing is worthless. However, if your example of what great writing is Hemingway or something, and you're trying to write great, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure because you think, oh, I'm never going to write like Hemingway, therefore why bother? And she included an example that I really loved where she talked about one of the best pieces of writing that she'd ever read was a dishwasher instruction manual. And I laughed out loud when I read that, because you think, why that of all things? But she used it, I think, primarily as a point to illustrate empathy, because she'd broken a glass in the dishwasher and needed to retrieve the pieces of broken glass. And the manual talked her through that with empathy of, oh, this is kind of a bummer of a situation to be in, to hoik pieces of broken glass out of your dishwasher filter. And here's how you do it. And that for me was it was a good example of being holistic in your thinking of what is good writing and where can you find good writing. Because if you can find it in a dishwasher manual, you can find it everywhere. And sometimes I'm not analytical enough in what I'm reading. I just read something and think, oh, great, I've got the answer to my question. And part of being a great writer is perhaps you think, oh, I've got the answer to my question, but also I was guided to that answer in such a thoughtful, humane way. This is a piece of good writing. This is an example to follow.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point.
Yes.
And I think it's something that people gloss over. And I think you're right. I think it comes back down to empathy and like understanding who you're writing for and their pain points.
Yeah. It almost made me want to get out my dishwasher manual and be like, well, I wonder what these kids are saying.
Yeah, I think it's actually a good exercise, to like look for unexpected examples of good copy.
Yes. I saw an example online, a photo of a bottle of pet shampoo, and it had, along with the instructions, there was a warning, and it said, caution, when your dog is wet, they suddenly become much faster and smarter than you, so plan ahead.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant copy. And she talks about something which is kind of related, not exactly. Like she talks about, I think, scroll anchors, which is more for online. But like little things that you can inject, which kind of make people scroll or then intrigue people, or little hidden pieces of copy, which in my mind, that's not a scroll magnet, because it's not online, but it's like a little hidden treat for the reader.
She talks about that in the section of brand voice in the last section of the book, where she talks about the purpose of microcopy, which, if anyone's not aware, is just tiny examples of copy. So it's not the home page or an email. It's, for example, an error message on a broken link. Instead of saying, 404 page not found, you can just jazz up that copy with empathy for the reader, reflecting your brand voice. I thought that was really clever, because she, again, she's great for the example. She gives specific examples of where you can inject micro copy to infuse that personality.
And I think that's something that so many of us overlook. And it's a real opportunity to infuse these like unexpected places with your brand personality. To like make your reader feel like, wow, this company gets me, but like this is also what they're all about.
Yes. And it's, it's a clever way of making your brand stand out. I had a point that I wanted to bring up right at the end of the book. She does talk about AI writing, which I'm sure is a concern for many copywriters. We're reviewing the second edition of Everybody Writes, which came out in late 2022. ChatGPT 4 came out after the book was released, so she doesn't address it directly, and all of the, let's call them, big feelings that people in the copywriting community had when ChatGPT 4 was released. But she does talk about AI writing and other kinds of AI writing tools. And I think for me, that was just interesting to have her perspective on it. And in a nutshell, for me, her perspective was AI tools are already here, and we probably interact with them way more than we think we do. But these tools in the hands of a good writer, they help you to become a great writer, and they help your writing to become a superpower. For example, saving time on the less interesting bits of writing so that you can then devote that to the more interesting bits of writing and to getting better at writing. So it doesn't just speed up your entire process, it speeds up part of your process so that you have more time to devote to the elements that really need a human hand, a human eye, human perspective.
I think what I also got from that section, it was that she says, like, AI is not going to replace us. It's not like this robot coming, which is the big fear.
Yeah.
And to your point, like the fears have grown since this book was published, but I still think there's merit in what she said. And like exactly what you said, like it's going to enhance the way we write. It's going to make us maybe more creative. And like my 2 cents is that I think it's going to, and you're already seeing it, like you're seeing that the writers writing stands out more than the ChatGPT stuff. It just does.
So. I wanted to also touch on a point that she covers in different areas throughout the book about metrics for measuring your writing.
I love that
it's
section.
Not that she talks about it in detail, but I think she talks about metrics in terms of you need to write to be a writer, and the importance of having a target to hit with your daily writing goal. She sets her target based on number of words that she must write per day. I think she chooses 999 words, and she prefers that over having a time limit to your writing practice, because for her it's all about how much you actually produce. And later on in another metric that it's not really even a metric, I suppose, but it was an interesting point of, what you get out of good writing. And she says, right at the beginning of the book, great writing makes us feel. And she says in the book, I was going to put another word at the end of that, makes us feel, adjective. But no, great writing makes us feel, full stop. And I think that that's something to strive towards in my own writing. And the feeling doesn't have to be profound. You don't have to change somebody's world with everything that you write, but there should be a feeling there.
So as somebody who writes for B2B companies, again, in the clean tech space, that point stood out for me because there's this sense that like B2B space is very formal, very stuffy, not emotional. And she addresses that. And she says that that's not true. She says that's a space where we need creativity and we need all these things, because these are often businesses with people who are making decisions that directly affect the bottom line in a way that it may not be as drastic as it is for the B2C space. And I really think that's a valuable point. And I think that it also gave me hope for the kind of work that I'm doing, because I think there's a sense that needs to be very, very formal. And the other thing I wanted to say was about KPIs. She has this whole section on like different kinds of KPIs that she measures. Like, she talks about like a number of people who've replied or
to her emails. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is like a different way of thinking about it. You know what I mean? As opposed to like conversion rate or opens or.
Yes, I thought that was a really nice way of looking at that, because when we're talking about email copywriting, it's so easy to get hooked on open rate and click-through rate. And she points out that sometimes this kind of laser focus on those metrics can actually destroy long-term your writing, because people may get less responsive to it. Perspective on.
I think it's also a very refreshing way to look at these content pieces. I think, like, let's say you are an email copywriter, to go to your client and say, I'm going to increase X and it's going to have this impact on your bottom line. Okay, that's great. But like, there's also the human side of it, like building relationships with your clients and like showing them that side of it, which I think is undervalued often.
Yes. And writing something that people really want to read.
Right.
I loved her part. It wasn't in the email bit, but I thought about it when she was talking about emails, when she's talking about writing things that are actually newsworthy, so that you imagine a woman reading it and turning to her husband and saying, well, would you listen to this, Ira? Yeah. I think we've covered all of the points that the points that I wanted to discuss in the book. Is there anything else that came to you before we move on to our implementation goals?
No, I think that's I love the way she ended the book, but we'll keep that as a surprise for readers. Like, I love the quote and then her last sentence, which I really like. We'll leave that as a surprise. No, that's it.
Yes. Okay, so because on the Tried It podcast, we don't just talk about books about copywriting, we talk about what we've learned from them and what we're actually going to do with that learning. We are now going to talk about the things that we are going to commit to practicing in our own work and on our own businesses. So let's set our 3 implementation goals each and talk about where we're going to apply them and how we're going to track them. So you go first, Nicole.
Sure. So the first thing, going back to the GPS writing, I'm gonna commit to focusing on that and then using that to streamline and fix the holes in my process. Going back to all the conversation we had about editing, focusing specifically on editing. So that's the first thing, like my writing process.
Yeah.
She has a whole piece on how to organize different pieces of content. And the funny thing is, because I look at copywriting as more like an art, like I just kind of create. To be honest with you, like, organization in copy and I guess in life is not my strong suit, which is a problem. So like, I also, one of my implementation goals, which sounds weird, is I want to be more thoughtful about how I organize my pieces of content and play with that. She has a whole sorts of ideas on how to do that and different forms you can take copy and content. So I want to focus on that. And then my other implementation thing, which goes back to me wanting to turn my writing into more of a craft and into a habit, is one of her writing prompts, which is the did, saw, heard, draw writing prompt, which I loved, which is basically every day you take a piece of paper and you divide it into 4 quadrants. And the top left, you write, what did I do today? What I did. What did I see? What did I hear? And then you draw something from the day, which I love. It's a very quick, easy way to get writing.
Oh, nice. So you're going to do that every day then?
Yes.
Okay, so just to recap, your 3 goals then are the daily writing habit with the quadrant.
Right.
The applying the writing GPS process to your client work, and what was the third one?
And the other one is about organizing. So
organizing.
I want to play with that, for example, like in my LinkedIn posts specifically, and like how I'm going to try and play with organizing my content in different ways. Right, Sarah.
Just touching on your LinkedIn posts, I think it could be interesting, if any of our listeners want to follow you on LinkedIn, perhaps you could also report back on LinkedIn and say, oh, I used to write my posts in this style like this, and now I'm trying out this. Once you've found your feet a little bit, it'll be interesting to see, because LinkedIn will be a really good place for you to see what kind of response you get using Anne Handley's format for posts. Are you getting more engagement? Are you getting more views, more likes?
Very good point. Never thought about that. Cool. I will try. So I'll add that to my LinkedIn thing. What about you?
Yes. So my 3 commitments to implement from Everybody Writes are: number 1, like you, I'm also going to do the daily writing habit. I'm not going to use the quadrant one. It's not that it's a bad idea. It just didn't speak to me as much. And I know myself. And if I'm like, oh, cool idea for somebody else, I'm not going to do it. And I actually want to really stick to this goal. So I bought a pack of mostly fiction writing prompts from a book coach called Claire L. Fishback. I'll link her details in the show notes if anybody else wants to buy the same prompts. So that's my implementation commitment number 1 of the daily writing habit. Number 2, also like you, I'm going to commit to using a process to edit my work with Anne Handley's reframe of editing is the fun part of writing. I'm going to commit to use Anne Handley's book as a guide with at least 2 kinds of editing for every piece of writing. One where I'm looking in detail and one where I'm taking an overview. And I'm going to commit to spending at least as long a time on editing the piece as I do on writing it. So whatever kind of writing I do, whether it's a LinkedIn post or an email or whatever, I'll track the writing time and use that same amount of time on editing.
Amazing.
My last one, I'm struggling to put this in a clear way, which is kind of ironic, but I think that I need to go for being more clear and precise with my writing. As you can tell, I ramble. I ramble out loud, and the rambles also end up on paper. So I want to really focus on being more clear and concise so that I'm being empathetic to the reader by respecting their time more. But I'm not sure how I can kind of track that as a metric.
I think you might also be able to use LinkedIn to test that. Like, it's not client work, but you could sort of see, again, like in our test period, like if you have a different response to the kind of post, or you could even take a post that you've written like a while back and like rewrite it in a way that fits this formula of like respecting readers' time. I don't know, and see if it performs better.
That's an interesting one, actually. I really love that as an idea. Okay, I will go back through my last year of posts and pick. I do want to post on LinkedIn more. So maybe if I post twice a week and one of those posts is a rewrite of an old post, and I'll see if it performed better. Okay. We're going to hit screenshot city so that I can see if there's any actual results with this.
It's a good experiment.
Okay. So just to recap, my 3 implementation commitments are the daily writing habit, the using a process to edit and spending as much time on editing as writing, and the clarity goal, rewriting my LinkedIn posts with clarity in mind. So it's interesting. We've gone for some similar ones, but not exactly the same.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to see like what kind of findings we have, and like if we feel this improves our final product, and also if clients notice a difference. Like, I'm actually curious to see once I implement, like if they notice a difference in my work.
Yes, really good point. So with that, I think we can wrap up here, and because it's the Tried It podcast, we will report back on how we did, whether it worked or whether it didn't work.
Great. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks for listening, and catch us next time. Bye.
Bye.